When revolution came to Cuba, I was pleased to see that democracy was coming to that island.
Ich hatte gedacht, Castro sei ein...
I thought that Castro was a real, genuine, colorful, popular national hero, a savior of his nation.
A menos que fuésemos reaccionarios, no teníamos...
Unless we were reactionaries, we would have no right to think that Castro could not fulfill his goal. The victory of Fidel Castro was the victory of all of us Latin Americans, proud, nationalistic, and lovers of freedom.
Havana, January 1st, 1959.
Fidel Castro desde Oriente, a Batista combatió. Fidel Castro desde Oriente, a Batista combatió. Y a la patria libertó con sus hombres dignamente. ¡Que viva Fidel! ¡Que viva Fidel! ¡Que viva Fidel! Y la bandera cubana.
The 26 de Julio, the 26th of July movement, led by Fidel Castro, had turned out the tyrant Batista. To the Cuban people and to the admiring world, there could be no better way to start the new year. A correspondent remembers those heady days. Aristides Molion of Venezuela's Últimas Noticias.
23 days after Castro's victory, we received him in Caracas. He had just triumphed over a dictatorship, and therefore we welcomed his revolution. Castro was an impassioned man, but a civil war is no joke. We had hopes that he would allow the Cuban people to decide on their own future, to take their place in the sun, and to adapt their institutions to their desires.
The revolutionary leader now took to the public square in Havana to tell the people what victory meant. There would soon be general elections. There would be a free press, beholden to no one. There would be land for the peasants. This revolution, Fidel Castro told the people standing in the sun of the Prado, is as native as the Cuban palms. But first there was further bloodletting to be done. The world had mixed emotions about such violent retribution, as convicted torturers and collaborators fell with a maximum of publicity and a minimum of due process of law. It was the 7th month in power of the Cuban Revolution. While the people waited for the first free general election in 20 years, as Fidel had promised, political orientation was carried out under the orders of Che Guevara, an Argentine with a Botticelli angel's face and a scholar of Marx. From obscurity came Cuban communist leader Blas Roca, claiming that communists had fought as hard as anyone else in the revolution. It was a fiction curiously tolerated by Castro. On the night of July 13th, Provisional President Manuel Urrutia, a liberal judge who had denounced Batista and had been forced into exile for his pains, went on national television. There he warned that communism is not concerned with the welfare of the people, that it constitutes a danger for the Cuban Revolution. Among those who listened and watched was the man who had brought President Urrutia back from exile. 4 days later, he took to the television channels to accuse Urrutia of treason. Urrutia resigned and was put under virtual house arrest. Later, he once again sought political refuge. Signor Fedeli of the Socialist Party of Italy recalls the time.
It was the degeneration of the revolutionary movement. No elections were held. There was no democratic debate inside the revolutionary movement itself. The ideas of dissenters were not discussed, since those who expressed opinions in disagreement with the majority were persecuted. as happened in the case of Huberto Matos, who was sentenced to 20 years.
It was the 10th month of the Cuban Revolution. Léo Sauvage of Le Figaro, Paris, observed that it was stillborn.
To serve truth, one must serve freedom. These are the two recommendations that Albert Camus, in his speech in Sweden, made to the writer, and they can also be applied to the journalists. Journalists who wish to examine the situation in Cuba 4 years after the revolution have to begin by acknowledging three undeniable facts that underlie everything that happened later. The first was the arrest in October of 1959 of Commander Hubert Matos, who was one of the first of Castro's colleagues and who was arrested in his general headquarters in Camagüey. He was arrested for one reason, because he wrote a letter to Castro in which he expressed his disagreement with the communizing position. It wasn't as yet a communist one, but a communizing position of the government. He took no stand, he made no action, he made no rebellion. He merely wrote a letter to a friend who was also a chief. He was arrested, and despite Castro's request for a death sentence, he was sentenced to 20 years in jail. Now, I believe that it is this fact that Camus, were he still alive, would have borne in mind when he prepared those two principles: the refusal to deny what one knows and resistance to oppression.
In early 1960, the serious communication problem that existed between the United States and Cuba grew worse. U.S. Ambassador Philip Bonsal, who had come to Cuba with support and greetings for the revolution, was rebuffed. What would amount to $350 million worth of land and property was expropriated without compensation. United States offers to reconcile differences went ignored. From his suite high up in the Havana Hilton Hotel, where he would often seek his own tormented counsel, Castro now made his choice. On February 4th, 1960, the Havana airport resounded to the excitement and confusion attendant to great occasions of state. The arriving celebrity, Anastas Mikoyan, first deputy premier of the Soviet Union. In the month that followed, Cuba and Russia signed economic and trade agreements. Henceforth, Cuban sugar would sweeten the cups of Russian tea drinkers. $100 million worth of credit would be extended. Soon after, Che Guevara, the new honorary citizen of Cuba, and Fidel's brother Raul went to communist Eastern Europe. Toasts were offered. So were arms. In this 1960 Havana May Day parade, the arms are Czech. Soon, they will be Soviet. From the Kremlin, Nikita Khrushchev pledged that the Soviet Union is raising its voice and extending a helpful hand to the people of Cuba. In the case of necessity, he threatened, Soviet artillerymen can support the Cuban people with rocket fire. Meeting in San Jose, Costa Rica, the foreign ministers of the American republics declared that such extracontinental intervention, as they termed it, endangers the security of this hemisphere. In response, Raul Roa, Castro's foreign minister, walked out.